or the greatest kick of all was getting the European performers to come on. Because up to that time, that hadn't been done.
That's right.
And it was a great thrill to have them, Chevaliers and, so many of them.
They were America's most beloved entertainers. The funny uncle everyone trusted. The voice of Christmas. The king of television. But behind the smiles were FBI investigations, Communist Party hearings, organized crime connections, family abuse allegations, and controversies that were hidden from the public for decades. In this countdown, you'll discover why Frank Sinatra spent decades under FBI surveillance, how Lucille Ball nearly lost everything during the Red Scare, why Jerry Lewis became one of the most controversial figures in disability rights, and the heartbreaking memoir that forever changed how millions of people viewed Bing Crosby. Every story in this video is based on documented evidence, newspaper archives, congressional testimony, FBI files, published biographies, and first-hand accounts. No tabloid rumors, just the facts. And trust me, the #1 story is so disturbing that many people say they'll never hear White Christmas the same way again. Let's begin. Number 8. Milton Berle, the ego, NBC couldn't control. Milton Berle was, by any measure, the first true star of American television. Born Mendel Berlinger in 1908, he changed his name at 16 and by 1948 was hosting Texaco Star Theater, a show so dominant it reportedly doubled the number of televisions sold in the United States. He became Uncle Milty, Mr. Television, a beloved figure who worked clean on camera for his entire career. But behind that clean image was a documented reputation, inside the industry, for something else entirely. An ego that consistently ran over everyone around him. The most famous case happened in 1979, when Berle guest-hosted Saturday Night Live. According to accounts from the show's own writers, Berle spent the broadcast upstaging the cast, inserting his own old material, and closing the show with an unauthorized, tear-jerking musical number, complete with a standing ovation nobody had approved. Producer Lorne Michaels was reportedly so unhappy with the episode that it was pulled from rerun rotation for over 2 decades before finally resurfacing in 2003. That wasn't an isolated incident. At the 1982 Emmy Awards, Berle and Martha Raye were presenting the award for Outstanding Writing. Berle refused to hand over the microphone to the actual winners from Cersei TV, repeatedly talking over writer and actor Joe Flaherty's acceptance speech. Flaherty's dry response, telling Berle to go back to sleep, reportedly left Berle visibly rattled on live television. Berle's reputation off-camera extended to his personal life as well. By his own account, laid out candidly in his autobiography, he had numerous affairs throughout his career, including with Marilyn Monroe, though Monroe herself later said she had no memory of any relationship when the two co-starred in a film years later. Wikipedia and multiple biographical accounts describe Berle as an avid gambler and, in his own words, a womanizer for most of his adult life. None of this makes Berle a villain in the way tabloids love to frame these things. What it does show is a documented pattern. A performer whose public persona as everyone's favorite uncle concealed a well-known, well-sourced reputation for controlling every room he walked into, whether the room wanted him to or not. Number 7. Jackie Gleason, the Great One's darker side. Jackie Gleason earned the nickname the Great One from Orson Welles, reportedly after a long night of drinking together. It stuck, and it fit, because Gleason built one of the most successful careers in television history on the back of characters like Ralph Cramden in The Honeymooners. But according to multiple biographers, including William A. Henry III and cast members themselves, Gleason's behavior behind the scenes told a very different story than the lovable bus driver he played on screen. Gleason had a documented, heavy drinking habit that colleagues say frequently affected his work. CBS executive Oscar Katz, quoted in Henry's biography, said there was no single, real Jackie Gleason, only the belligerent, depressive version that emerged when he'd been drinking, which, according to Katz, was often. Co-star Joyce Randolph has described the sheer anxiety of working with him because Gleason refused to rehearse, insisting he had a photographic memory. Cast members frequently didn't see the actual script until hours before a live broadcast. Randolph said she would break into cold sweats before filming. Art Carney, Gleason's co-star, and the actor who played Ed Norton, reportedly had it worse. Biographers describe Gleason as intensely jealous of Carney's talent, at one point telling Orson Welles that whenever the audience laughed at Carney, he smiled on the outside but felt something very different underneath. Gleason also referred to Carney at times as his subordinate, despite the two sharing what became one of the most beloved on-screen partnerships in television history. Gleason's appetite for excess extended to food, cigarettes, and alcohol, on a scale that became almost mythical, up to 5 packs of cigarettes a day, and drinking sessions that colleagues and biographers describe as legendary, including marathon nights alongside his friend Frank Sinatra. He himself maintained publicly that he was not an alcoholic and never drank on show days, but the accounts from people who actually worked with him tell a more complicated story. Number 6. Bob Hope, the patriot who became the establishment. Bob Hope's image was built on decades of USO tours, entertaining American troops in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf, right up through his 90s. Congress eventually named him the first honorary veteran in American history. That legacy is real and well documented. But 2 other, less flattering threads are just as well documented. The first is financial. A 1968 Fortune magazine estimate put Hope's net worth somewhere between $150 and $200 million, most of it tied up in real estate holdings across California, Arizona, and Puerto Rico. According to a Rolling Stone profile that interviewed numerous NBC production executives who worked with Hope over the years, many of them described him, on the record, as having a reputation for underpaying his writing staff and cutting corners on production costs, even as his television specials made him extraordinarily wealthy. Hope himself acknowledged in interviews that the bulk of his fortune came from property, not performing. The second thread is political. During the Vietnam War, Hope's unwavering pro-military stance, initially framed as simple support for the troops, evolved into open political alignment with the Nixon administration. He helped organize the 1970 Honor America Day rally in Washington, intended as a unifying, non-partisan event, but widely interpreted and protested as a pro-war rally. Hope became personally close with President Nixon, who, according to Hope's biographer Richard Zoglin, used Hope as a mouthpiece to carry administration messaging to the public. Some of Hope's own USO shows during this period were met with boos from the very troops he was performing for, and Hope himself acknowledged, in a 1970 interview, that he'd stayed away from anything that looked like it was commercializing on patriotism until he felt the media coverage of the war had become unfair. The result was a performer who spent the back half of his career being described by young Americans, and later by his own biographer, as the embodiment of the establishment, wealthy, politically connected, and increasingly out of step with the country he'd once represented as an everyman. If you're enjoying the receipts so far, drop a comment with which one surprised you most, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Number 5. Jerry Lewis and the telethon that divided the disability community. Jerry Lewis raised, by MDA's own estimates, well over $1 billion for the Muscular Dystrophy Association across more than 4 decades, hosting the Labor Day telethon. To millions of viewers, he was a hero, the man who cried on camera every September fighting for Jerry's kids. But that same nickname, Jerry's Kids, became the center of one of the most sustained public controversies in the history of American charity television, and it came directly from people the telethon claimed to represent. In 1981, Evan Kemp Jr., a disability rights advocate who would later chair the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times directly criticizing the telethon's format. Kemp argued that using children to evoke pity reinforced exactly the stereotypes that were holding disabled adults back from independent lives. The criticism sharpened in 1990 when Lewis wrote a first-person essay for Parade magazine, imagining himself as a disabled adult, describing his hypothetical existence using language about being confined to half a person. Disability rights activists, many of them former Jerry's kids themselves, now grown adults, were outraged. A group calling itself Jerry's Orphans, founded by former poster child Mike Irvin, staged organized protests against the telethon in 16 cities in 1992 alone. Their argument, made repeatedly and publicly for over 2 decades, the telethon fixated almost entirely on children, ignored the roughly 70% of people with muscular dystrophy who are adults, and used pity as a fundraising tool instead of dignity. Lewis, for his part, never backed down publicly. In a 1992 interview on ABC's Primetime Live, he told host Chris Wallace bluntly that tugging at heartstrings was simply what made the telethon work. Without it, he said, there was no point being on the air. The dispute became national news, eventually pulling in the Bush White House after activists lobbied for federal disability policy changes. And it didn't fully die down until Lewis's departure from the telethon in 2011. The money Lewis raised was real. So was the anger he generated in the community he said he was helping, and both are part of the documented record. Number 4, Lucille Ball, and the Communist Party registration that nearly ended, I Love Lucy. By 1953, Lucille Ball was the single biggest star on American television. I Love Lucy was watched by a majority of the country every week. And then, on September 6th of that year, radio gossip columnist Walter Winchell announced on air that a top red-headed television comedian had been confronted about membership in the Communist Party. It was true, and it was on record. FBI files, later obtained by the Washington Post, and Ball's own sworn testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee confirmed that in 1936, Ball had registered to vote as a member of the Communist Party in Los Angeles County. A former screenwriter, testifying to WHAC investigators, further stated that a Communist Party new members meeting had actually been held at Ball's home in 1937, though Ball reportedly wasn't present that day. FBI records also indicated she had been named a delegate to the party's state central committee and had participated in party-linked radio broadcasts as late as 1940. Ball's explanation, repeated consistently in both her WHAC testimony and later in her autobiography, was that she'd registered in 1936 purely to please her grandfather, Fred Hunt, a committed socialist who had effectively raised her and who, she said, pressured the family to register that way to support a local candidate. She testified she had never actually voted that way and was never an active party member. Given the severity of the Second Red Scare, an era in which actors like John Garfield saw their careers effectively destroyed by similar accusations, Ball's outcome was remarkably soft. Her WHAC interview was conducted privately. Her case was quietly dismissed, and I Love Lucy never missed a broadcast. Media historians have since noted that Ball's immense popularity and the financial stakes CBS and sponsor Philip Morris had riding on the show likely played a significant role in how gently the investigation was ultimately handled compared to less famous names caught in the same net. Number 3. Frank Sinatra and 40 years of FBI surveillance. No entertainer on this list has a documented paper trail like Frank Sinatra. The FBI compiled a file on him that eventually ran to roughly 2,400 pages, tracking his associations across 4 decades. Declassified and released to the public in the late 1990s, the file lists direct, repeated contact with major organized crime figures: Chicago boss Sam Giancana, Carlo Gambino, Willie Moretti, and Joseph Fischetti, a cousin of Al Capone. This wasn't guilt by association. According to the file, when Giancana was arrested in 1958, police found Sinatra's private phone number in his wallet. Sinatra reportedly performed at clubs and casinos controlled by organized crime figures throughout the 1950s and 60s. most notably the Sands in Las Vegas. He introduced Giancana to Marilyn Monroe and, according to multiple biographers and his own daughter Tina Sinatra, he introduced Giancana to John F. Kennedy's inner circle during the 1960 presidential campaign, reportedly performing at one of Giancana's own Chicago clubs as a thank you afterward. The consequences were real and documented. In 1963, Sinatra lost his Nevada gambling license after Giancana, who had been formally blacklisted by state gaming regulators, was found to be a guest at Sinatra's Cal Neva Lodge resort. Sinatra was called to testify, under oath, in front of a joint Senate-House Select Committee on Crime in 1972, and again in front of the Nevada Gaming Control Board in 1981, while trying to regain a gambling license for a new venture. He denied any mafia membership every time, and no charges were ever filed against him. The FBI's own assessment concluded he was never caught in an actual crime, only what agents termed suspicious activities. There's also a widely reported physical altercation from 1967 after Sinatra broke his contract with the Sands to sign with the mob-connected Caesars Palace. Casino manager Carl Cohen reportedly knocked out two of Sinatra's teeth during a confrontation that started when Sinatra trashed the hotel's lobby and pool area in anger. Whether Sinatra was, in his own words, simply a man whose last name ended in a vowel and got unfairly tarred by association, or something closer to what the FBI file suggests, is still debated by historians. What isn't debated is that the surveillance, the testimony, and the license revocation all actually happened. Number 2. Dean Martin and the Rat Pack's racial humor problem. Dean Martin's laid-back, boozy persona made him one of the most beloved members of the Rat Pack, alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. Most of that persona, according to fellow Rat Pack member Joey Bishop, was actually an act. Bishop said in a 1998 interview that he never once saw any of them actually drunk on stage. What was real, and extensively documented on surviving recordings of their live shows, was the racial content of their act. A filmed 1965 performance in St. Louis, one of the only Rat Pack stage shows ever captured on film, shows Martin delivering a joke to Davis about sitting at the back of the bus, a line the group had reportedly used for years in the middle of the American civil rights movement. Davis was consistently the target of the majority of racial jokes during these performances, according to biographers and contemporary reviewers, though he would occasionally return jokes about white people back at his bandmates. The context matters, and historians are genuinely split on how to read it. Davis's own biographer, Will Haygood, and several Rat Pack historians note that Sinatra and Martin used real influence to protect Davis and desegregate Las Vegas venues that had refused to let black performers stay in the hotels where they performed. Martin, who had faced his own anti-Italian prejudice and anglicized his name from Dino Crocetti, reportedly refused to attend John F. Kennedy's 1961 inauguration after Davis was excluded from the guest list. Davis himself, for his part, quietly funneled large portions of his performance fees to Martin Luther King Jr. and the NAC throughout this period, without publicizing it. At the same time, Davis was called an Uncle Tom by some critics for decades over his participation in the routines and multiple retrospectives, including a Globe and Mail piece built around a stage revival of the act decades later, described the racial material as something audiences today would find genuinely difficult to watch, regardless of the era's context or the group's private politics. We're down to the final entry, and it's the one that split an entire family in public. Sons on one side, sons on the other, and a memoir that's still debated 50 years later. If you want more of these deep-sourced dives into the darker corners of entertainment history, subscribe now before we get into it. Number 1. Bing Crosby and Going My Own Way. Bing Crosby's White Christmas is still the best-selling single in recorded history. For generations of Americans, his voice meant exactly one thing: warmth, home, comfort, family. 6 years after Crosby's death in 1977, his eldest son, Gary Crosby, published a memoir called Going My Own Way, a direct, pointed reference to his father's famous film, Going My Way, in which Bing played a beloved, gentle priest. The book detailed, in Gary's own words, years of systematic physical abuse. According to Gary's account, later confirmed in detail by People magazine and multiple newspaper interviews at the time, his father would weigh him weekly as a child, and if Gary had gained weight, he'd be summoned to his father's office for a beating. Gary described being beaten almost daily as a child, saying his father would come home at 6 o'clock and within minutes already know what infraction had occurred that day. He described being beaten with a belt until he bled, and later, as he got older, with a cane. Gary said he eventually broke the cane over his own knee and warned his father never to hit him again. This wasn't just Gary's account. His younger brother Lindsay publicly supported the memoir at the time of publication, saying he was glad Gary had written it and hoped it would clear up old lies. According to a PBS American Masters documentary on Crosby's legacy, 2 of Bing's 4 sons from his first marriage later confirmed the abuse on the record, and both of those brothers, Lindsay and Dennis, went on to take their own lives in later years. A third brother, Philip, pushed back hard against Gary's account, calling him a whining, bitching crybaby, and insisting their father never beat them, in his words, black and blue, and that any punishment they received, they deserved. Bing's own brother, bandleader Bob Crosby, described Bing simply as a strict disciplinarian, consistent with how their own parents had raised them. The memoir also touched on Crosby's regular use of racial slurs at home, according to Gary's account, and detailed his father's extramarital affairs and heavy drinking, which Gary said were kept carefully hidden from the public image Bing maintained throughout his career. The reaction to the book split readers for decades, and still does. Some reviewers who lived through the period have said Gary's account reads less like a hatchet job and more like a son working through his own alcoholism and inherited pain, ultimately taking responsibility for his adult problems rather than simply blaming his father. Others have pointed out that Gary's mother, Dixie Lee, struggled with alcoholism throughout his childhood and likely contributed just as much to the household's dysfunction. What isn't disputed is that the book was real, it was published under Gary's own name, it was confirmed in detail by at least 2 of his brothers, and it permanently altered how an entire generation heard White Christmas playing every December. 8 performers, 8 documented controversies, mob surveillance, congressional testimony, disability rights protests, and a family memoir that's still argued about today. What connects almost all of them is the same thing: a carefully built public image and a private record that took years, sometimes decades, to actually surface. If one of these caught you off guard, let me know which one in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want the next deep dive into Golden Age Hollywood the moment it drops, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.